There's a new type of rock star who can go on a world tour and sell out shows without playing a single note. Fans pay hundreds of dollars just to listen to them talk. Sam Harris, neuroscientist, philosopher, best-selling author, and host of the podcast Waking Up, is one of this new breed of rock stars. He's coming to Auckland in August as part of the Day of Reckoning tour, challenging audiences to engage in civil conversations about topics like politics and race. Now, Sam Harris is famously atheist, and he argues that reason and science are the only tools that can build a civil society. He's on the line with us now. Hello there.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, nice to chat. In this celebrity-obsessed age, Sam, this age of internet trolling and triviality, do you understand why people would pay hundreds of dollars to hear you speak?
Well, it's a difficult question to answer. I encourage them to do that because I love the opportunity to meet with a good group of people. I think there is a kind of now a strange scarcity in face-to-face meetings. So there's something about a live event that is unique, and especially if it's not recorded, if you don't have a choice to see the video on YouTube. But we expect more or less everything for free now digitally, and it's the experience of many of us, certainly not just me, that there's a real hunger for something that is comparatively scarce, and you were either in the room or you weren't at the time it happened. And so, I think people view live events as a kind of a special case now. So, but it's a very, I'm as surprised by the phenomenon as I think you are. It's amazing that, many of us can sell out very large auditoriums and even arenas to simply have conversations. I mean, this is not Justin Bieber coming to your town with a light show. This is a conversation.
You've been called a new atheist. People might have heard that term. And then there's this other one, a renegade of the intellectual dark web. Is that latter one a phrase you're comfortable with? And might you explain for us the intellectual dark web?
Well, it's an analogy that I've always taken as fairly tongue-in-cheek. I'm somewhat responsible for it propagating online because a guest on my podcast, Eric Weinstein, is actually coming with me to Auckland in August for this conference. He's a mathematician and physicist, and he used this analogy to describe this phenomenon that's based mostly on podcasts, but the fact that there many of us are finding very large audiences who are hungry for long-form conversations on polarizing and significant topics, and that this is happening largely in the dark with respect to the mainstream media. So people on CNN or the New York Times don't necessarily know that those of us who have best-selling podcasts or highly ranked podcasts are reaching, so in many cases, larger audiences in long-form conversations. And so his analogy was that this is the intellectual dark web, not to be confused with the dark web online where people are buying child pornography and weapons and MDMA. So I just, with very little thought, titled the episode of the podcast where he appeared with me. Actually, it was probably the second time he used that phrase. And then the title just got spread, and then there was a subsequent New York Times article about the so-called intellectual dark web. And this is just the group of people who are wrapped up under this banner have very little in common apart from the fact that they are tending to find large audiences outside of mainstream channels, and they are against the recent efforts we see, especially on college campuses, but elsewhere, to suppress free speech, largely coming from the left side of the political spectrum. And that's but otherwise there are conservatives and liberals in this group, and it's not a unified group with any sort of ideology.
Let's talk about the campus free speech. One of your guests lost his job for speaking his mind. Can you tell us about Brett Weinstein's story?
Yeah, well, he was at a college that many of us had never heard of prior to this scandal, but it was Evergreen College, and it's, I think, well known to be one of the most liberal, if not the most liberal campuses in the U.S. At the time. I don't know what's happening there now. I think the whole institution is in free fall. I think they're having a hard time even getting the next class of students. But what happened there is that there had been traditionally something called a day of absence, which was uh, I think it's been going on for something like 20 years, where the people of color in both in the student body and in the on staff there at the college decided to take it one day of the year to not show up on campus and make their absence felt as a sign of just as a symbolic reminder of just how much work there is to do to achieve a race blind society.
Mm.
And that's something that Brett Brett is as left as can be in his politics. That's something that he always supported, and there's just no issue there, except this year, and this was last year. They decided to flip the logic of it, and rather than have people of color voluntarily stay away from campus, they told white people that they shouldn't come to campus. And Brett pointed out that this really does just make a mockery of the ethics of the situation and the politics, and it becomes a kind of nakedly racist declaration that certain people of the wrong skin color are not welcome on campus. And so, he said, listen, I totally support the cause of diversity. I'm as liberal as they come, but I can't support this. And so I will be coming to work today, that day. And for that stand he took, he was just not merely vilified as a racist, but run off of campus by a mob. I mean, there were, baseball bat wielding groups of deranged students hunting for him on campus, apparently. And the police contacted him and told him that he could not be protected. He could not be kept safe. And in fact, the president of the college told the police to stand down. He didn't want the police patrolling the campus to protect their embattled faculty. And so, he wound up talking about this to the press, and it became a huge scandal. And then the university blamed him for having damaged their reputation by deigning to speak about this publicly. And so he wound up, getting fired or leaving. And I think there's a subsequent lawsuit that is playing out. But anyway, the whole thing has been a disaster for Evergreen because the side of sanity in this equation has been so easy to discern. I mean, you have a movement on campus that has so fetishized race and this is not merely race in this case, but race and gender and the other unchangeable qualities of human difference, that it's just making it impossible to talk about human difference or anything else of political consequence in this context. And so it's very disturbing that the hostility to free speech we are seeing on campuses is so reliably coming from the left at this moment, especially for those of us who are on the left with respect to every other question.
Yeah, and given that the college made that decision that they were going to have a day where white people weren't allowed to come to campus, I mean, ideally, presumably in your view, they would never have made that decision. But given they made it and Brett decided to go along, in an ideal world, he would have gone along. There wouldn't have been any violent or aggressive protests. There might have been some conversations about whether he was in the right or the wrong. People listen to each other's perspective on it and come to some sort of resolution or don't. But it's the fever, isn't it? And the mob mentality and the sense that there is only one right answer, and if you don't agree with it, then you're a racist. That is probably most alarming.
Yeah, it's the quality of moral panic and the effort to destroy people's reputations as a way of silencing them without any actual honest engagement with their views. I mean, just to merely call someone a racist is so inflammatory and so very likely damaging to their reputation. I mean, the effort to prove you're not a racist in the face of these accusations is, in many cases insurmountable, because it's often an unfalsifiable claim about yourself. In Brett's case, it was especially idiotic because he's someone who is so far left and has such an impeccable pedigree with respect to this question of race. I mean, he actually got kicked out of he had to leave his undergraduate institution, the University of Pennsylvania, some 20 years ago, because he had taken a stand against a fraternity that had done something, unsavory and fairly racist in its kind of hazing ritual. I think they had African American strippers come to one of their parties, and he had heard about this, had taken such a strong stand against the apparent injustice of this that life became intolerable for him on that campus, and he had to leave. Right. So this is somebody who, at the age of 18, was on the right side of history with respect to his sensitivities about race and discrimination, and he's been that way ever since. And so it's like it was so risible to launch this accusation about him in the first place. But for many people, it's not so clear cut, right? It's just and so to be called a racist is very scary, and so this has a silencing effect. It doesn't have a silencing effect on a professor who's willing to lose his job and reinvent himself, but for everyone else, it's this kind of mob targeting of individuals, whether they're professors or journalists or just ordinary people, does exert an impressive silencing effect on everybody else. And I can tell you, as someone who's been on the receiving end of this to some degree myself, it is amazing to see what happens in the aftermath of these kinds of episodes. Because, and I know this happened to Brett as well, what you hear from people in private who support you. Yeah. Who cannot go public in their support of you. I mean, and so Brett heard, I think there was not a single professor at Evergreen who would publicly support him. I believe that's true to say, and yet, he heard from many people privately that they supported him, and that's the environment in which we're living and attempting to conduct reasoned conversations about the most crucial issues of the day, whether it's the reasons for war, or terrorism, whether it's immigration, whether it's gender issues or issues of race. I mean, we simply are finding that we can't talk about these things in a spirit of goodwill, because there's so people have installed these tripwires in their minds where if you don't make precisely the right noises in the right sequence, you are anathematized immediately, and the conversation just fails.
So much we could talk about. I guess maybe I could put the best objection to your argument, or the strongest objection, which might be, and I'm calling on all my Twitter training to come up with something here, Sam, that you don't actually have the right to give us your perspective on what's right and wrong with race, because you're a white guy, you've lived with white privilege, and that it's up to black people or other minorities to tell us what the right move is around race, not for you, an intellectual who doesn't truly understand what it's like to be a minority, to give us your view. I don't know how I've done there. I give myself about a 7 out of a 10, but would you like to...
Yeah, good work. Good work. Yeah. Well, I'm sold. All right, I'll stop. I'm sympathetic with the concern about so-called white privilege. I mean, there's no question that you are born with certain advantages. I mean, there are many kinds of advantages people can inherit just by dint of their birth, and the color of their skin is just one on a very long list, and certainly not the most important in this day and age in a place like the United States. But it has traditionally been an advantage, and there is no good reason for that, right? So I would be the first to admit that. And it's an advantage to be a male in various circumstances. It's an advantage to be tall if you're a male. It's certainly an advantage to be smart if you're anyone. It's an advantage to be healthy. It's an advantage to be rich. I mean, it's all kinds of privilege that people inherit that they didn't earn. And I think the moral significance of this, that I think of as just disparities in good and bad luck, is enormous. And I think we should want societies that correct for the most extreme inequities in how luck gets apportioned. And on the point of skin color, obviously we want to get to a time where skin color is truly meaningless, as indeed it is and should be. And the question is how to get there. And it seems to me patently obvious that the way we won't get there is to fetishize and fixate upon racial difference as though it was its significance was somehow written into the very fabric of reality. And that's what people on the left are doing under the rubric of identity politics and intersectionality, which is bringing these other unchangeable characteristics about people into play.
Can I ask, Sam, are there black people of colour in this lineup, in this conversation you're going to be having when you come to Auckland? Are there people who can challenge you better than I can on some of these things?
Well, no. Well, Majid Nawaz, he's from the UK, but his background is Pakistani. He's coming with us. I mean, but he doesn't really have a dog in this fight because he's certainly on my side of this particular debate. But we're having we're having a conference in New York in November where there will be a panel on race, and then on that panel there will be both sides of the spectrum politically and ideologically.
And will it be civil?
So I certainly hope so. We will make every effort to bring the conversation to some useful terminus that didn't entail fisticuffs.
There are several sessions in this event in Auckland in August, and the third session is a meditation workshop that you're leading. Can you tell me where this fits into the Sam Harris we know from the headlines and from the podcast?
Well, I've written a fair amount about meditation. I have one book that's totally devoted to meditation and how we can understand so-called spiritual experience in the context of science and rationality generally. I've written a lot about the nature of consciousness and the necessity of having a first-person introspective understanding of it. This is not something you can understand purely in third-person, neuroscientific or biological terms, because the truth is, from the third-person side, I mean, just merely looking at brains or their function, there's no evidence of consciousness in the physical universe at all. I mean, the only true evidence of consciousness is our first-person subjective experience of it. And meditation is a tool for exploring consciousness directly, and both based on intellectual curiosity, but also based on the very natural and pressing desire to mitigate psychological suffering. And you can discover through this practice that most of your suffering is born of your quite delusionally spending all your time lost in thought. You're just lost in this conversation you're having with yourself from the moment you wake up in the morning to the moment you fall asleep. And much of the character of this conversation is unpleasant. It's just you're just rehearsing your regrets and your anxieties and your all of the things that have that capture your attention in a way that in many cases is quite imaginary. I mean, you're thinking about things that may in fact never happen, and your thinking about them doesn't necessarily prepare you to face them better when they do happen. And so much of our mental effort is wasted. And meditation is a way of kind of seeing the automaticity of all of that and taking some responsibility for just paying attention, very clearly and honestly to the present moment in a way that liberates you from much of that suffering. And so, yeah, I'll be talking about it and introducing the practice at some point in that day-long conference.
I interviewed a guy a couple of months ago who was promoting TM, Transcendental Meditation, and man, he was convincing. I finished the conversation with him and I was like, I'm going to give this a go. And then I went away and I just thought, something doesn't feel quite right about this. I'm not sure what Jerry Seinfeld does it. He's a hero of mine. David Lynch does it. It was almost enough for me to go along to a class. And I thought it just feels like I'm being sold something. So
Yeah.
do you have a view on TM and how does yours differ from TM?
Yeah, I do. Well, there are two problems with TM in my view. And neither suggests that people aren't getting some significant benefit out of it. I mean, I think people are, but it is a very mercenary organization. I mean, they are selling you something. It has many of the trappings of a cult, and obviously, so that's less than ideal. But also the practice is, it's a different practice. I mean, the practice I recommend is something that's now widely referred to as mindfulness. And, there are sort of different ways of approaching that practice. But what it always entails is merely paying closer attention to the nature of your experience. You're not adding anything. You're certainly not adding anything that requires a fondness for Eastern religion or any kind of belief system. So with TM, you're doing something different. You're adding a mantra. You're rehearsing the sound in your mind as the technique of meditation. And that is, there's a fair barrier to entry there where you have to convince yourself that, there's something significant about using this Sanskrit phrase, born of, Hinduism to focus your attention. It's not that the technique doesn't work, but it is not perfectly designed for export to a skeptical, secular context. And mindfulness really is, because mindfulness is simply learning to pay attention to whatever is happening in your experience on its own without adding anything at all.
We're almost out of time. You are doing a Q&A at the event as part of the workshop. I just got an email from a listener. I'm going to put this one to you, and maybe you could give us a brief response to it, and Rachel can go along and hear from you. She listens to your podcasts, read a couple of your books. She has found that you've profoundly challenged her thinking, which she's enjoyed. She says Sam is staunchly against identity politics and takes the stance that we should be able to relate to one another as individuals transcending race. This view has found him offside with many on the traditional left. Given the very strong Maori cultural identity of New Zealand, I'd love to hear his thoughts on our situation in terms of having a separate Maori electoral role and Maori seats and a Maori party, etc. I do hope you'll have the opportunity to ask him about this, as arguably our situation is unique given that we have a Treaty of Waitangi. I don't expect you to understand or know the history of the Treaty of Waitangi, Sam, but do you have any views on New Zealand's unique situation before you arrive here?
Only that I'm bound to get myself into trouble by not knowing enough of the facts there.
Okay.
I'm sure I have a generic answer, which is that, again, we have to get past caring about these superficial differences. I mean, so this is not just with respect to race or culture. It extends to religion and gender and anything else that suggests that there's this indissoluble difference between whole groups of people that really, really matters ethically and politically. Now, yes, there's a history we're all trailing, individually and collectively, that over which people have more or less legitimate grievances. There's no doubt, and so that there are things that there are past injustices that we should want to, as a society, correct for, and I'm sure that extends to the context in New Zealand. But it's what is the end game for civilization? Are we going to colonize Mars and still care about differences in skin color? Is that really where this is all going? We're going to, push out toward the stars, and there's going to be a fist fight on Mars over differences with respect to identity. It's just completely insane, and we have to keep the insanity of it vivid and not ramify it with this notion that it really matters what your skin color is, or where your parents were born. And so that's, I think it's the end game we need to think about and talk about, honestly.
We've got a link to the Day of Reckoning and where to buy tickets on our website, rnz.co.nz/Jesse. Sam Harris is here with other very interesting guests in August in Auckland. And Sam Harris, thanks so much for your time today.
Well, thank you, Jesse. It's been a pleasure.